Hello, in this video I want to continue some of the conversation that we've been having about racial capitalism in relationship to the workers' strike resolution. If you haven't, I would definitely check out the last couple videos I did before I had pink hair, where I was just doing the intro to the workers' strike video, talking a little bit about why I think racial cap will be such a central criticism on this topic, and why I think it's like definitely a smart way for teams that are really reliant on the cap K on a lot of other resolutions to kind of like find a way to kind of make a lot of those arguments against policy and against critical affirmatives by kind of pivoting into racial capitalism and the way that it can kind of find problems with the state's recognition or a government's recognition of the workers' ability to strike. And so I definitely think that checking out those and kind of getting some of the background to like the history of like why there might be an anti-state kind of like adaptation for like what these teams are really looking at, and why that requires a kind of move away from normative kind of like vertical reading of capitalism that I think a lot of teams are like most comfortable in. And I think that it also then changes the way in which various types of policy teams respond to those arguments, which is what we'll be talking about in this video, where I really want to start talking about like what are some of the central priorities for policy teams that are thinking about how, and if at all, they're still going to have to debate the cap K on this resolution. The short answer to that, in my opinion, is that I still think that the cap K will be a really relevant argument under the resolution, because I think it's just a literature base that people are super comfortable in historically, and that definitely is like not like too far to be kind of like reachable or workable under this resolution. And obviously is a place where there will be a lot of like literature and like intense debate about the state's kind of role in what we should think of in terms of anti-capitalism, which I think is like a really rich debate to have if you're really able to kind of bring in the historical contingencies in order to kind of like answer and make detailed a lot of these debates that often end up happening between cap K arguments and what will probably end up being the main policy arguments for this resolution. In this video, I kind of wanted to just continue by kind of setting our priorities and then thinking about the ways that we can change and alter the framing and thesis concerns that policy teams are using normatively to really respond to what a racial cap criticism will look like, and how to make it more like nuanced, unique, and detailed in such a way that you're really getting all of the value out of the normative arguments that you want to read with your affirmative, while still being able to put pressure on the points that the negative is like really trying to like create as different from what you would normatively see on the cap K and what is then like strategic on this resolution. So the first place is just kind of like setting our priorities for like what types of arguments are really good versus this type of criticism. I think that when you're really trying to set your first priority, I think that the first thing is to really build the question of like, what does it mean to be like better than the status quo? I feel like a really good framework interpretation, or a really good framework argument, will really kind of come from interpretation about weighing the affirmative versus the consequences of the status quo. And I feel like then you have a really good place to just start. Like the kind of like standard for all the link arguments to be is just like you have to prove that the 1AC makes the status quo worse, not that it's just like not substantial enough or not radical enough in order to like change what you think is like fundamentally violent, etc. And I think that really like setting and kind of creating that bar as like a source of judge instruction can be really helpful throughout the debate as they're trying to figure out like how they should kind of decide between these tactics, and also can make it a lot easier for you to leverage a lot of the offense that you want to have about how possibly their alternative and other kind of like pieces of like offense or method explanation can be used as like offense against them, because of the ways in which like histories of like crackdown in the government's relationships to these movements could be fundamentally changed by like the power of the 1AC or the policy the 1AC is being practiced. The second thing is that I think it's really important is to weigh questions of immediacy in your impact framing. I think that on both sides of this debate, people are going to be having conversations about like capitalism causing extinction. I definitely think that there needs to be a strong conversation about like the role that the government's like responsiveness to worker strikes plays in like making and creating a more like not sustainable but a quicker and more efficient way to get access to being able to make the necessary reforms to kind of like stop us to moving towards like climate extinction or whatever type of like liberal warfare argument you really want to make with these types of arguments. And I think that it's really important to kind of like leverage the question of how the 1AC is able to access that immediacy question in the way that they're evaluating like the competition between like the impacts to your affirmative and the link arguments and other offense that the negative team will be reading, so that you can really win that it's like not just a question of like the impacts in the abstract, but also a question of the ability for us to like directly resolve these kinds of consequences, which I think is a really smart place for you to kind of like start weighing your offense and gives you like a very strategic route. I think that when we kind of just go to the framing debate as a whole, definitely starting with just this interpretation of being able to weigh the affirmative versus like the consequences of the status quo is super important. I definitely think that being able to make arguments that are relevant to like how the status quo is formed is like super important. I think that you can make an argument about why it's like educationally beneficial to be able to track like successes and failures as we relate to the conditions that are popping up around us every day, and why that allows us to have like more adaptable and like basically relevant tactics to how we're able to like address like violences that happen under capitalism and in the workforce, etc. And I think that also blends a lot of the questions with the procedural gains of like your interpretation, which is just like what should the abs burden wouldn't be right. And like obviously like whether or not a worker strike in general could solve every problem in the world is way beyond like the constraints of the resolution. But what the affirmative kind of can be contested on is its kind of like efficacy and ability to kind of like move beyond the conditions that make that kind of worker strike harder or impossible in the status quo and makes it less kind of efficient and applicable. And I think that being able to start there for a lot of the offense that you drive off your thesis, off of your framing arguments, can make it a lot easier for you to weigh both the procedural and educational benefits. And I really think that as an affirmative team, having that basis or an interpretation that's really able to access strong arguments on both is really important for giving the 1ER like ample room to be able to make the necessary pivots that it needs in order to like have or like just create a really strong argument as a whole. I then think that when you kind of transition into the thesis portion of the debate, a lot of the arguments that you should really be focusing on are like, what is the question of like how can like the history of the worker strike and its relationship to the state. I feel like you should like mix a lot of arguments about why it's not just a question of whether or not the state is able to recognize itself doing something good, but whether or not the recognition of such a strike could also ensure that workers are, for instance, paid during strikes. How could it ensure that workers don't feel like they have to sacrifice between like providing for their families and like having like fair conditions wherever they are working, and being able to create a relationship to like just government as a whole where there is a responsiveness to the needs of people that are kind of creating the like core industries and necessities that we need in order to like carry on as like a society. And I think be able to frame a lot of your arguments about like why that is substantially better than the conditions that allow for the status quo, and the ones that have destroyed the more radical movements that they're kind of citing on the alternative, starts to give the judge really like good insight into like how you'll end up debating the alternative, while simultaneously giving you a lot of places to really pivot your kind of like link turn offense against a lot of the common arguments that they want to make, when you're able to be like, the thesis of our affirmative is just a question of what ways can we make these platforms like more available in order to create a responsiveness from the government that actually changes these conditions and creates like policy and like action in the private sector. Because there are also like, for instance, the recognition of it as a right like allows basically a realignment of governments with citizenship instead of an alignment with like neoliberal institutions and basically like economic financiers. And I think that being able to like say that changes like the locus of how the government functions and why it would be such a radical change would be like really, really good places for you to bring a lot of historical depths that like really allows you to make a strong offensive arguments no matter like what kind of stuff the negative team brings up, and really allows you like some central places to really work off of no matter where the debate goes. And I think that's a really strong foundation for like a lot of the stuff that we'll be talking about in the next video. So hopefully you'll stay tuned in, and yeah, thank you always.